This presentation is on a performance audit by the Queensland Audit Office on fraud management in local government. The Queensland Audit Office delivers financial and performance audit services to give assurance to Parliament and the community about the performance and accountability of the public sector. We are committed to helping the public sector improve. Performance audits assess whether an entity is achieving its objectives economically, efficiently and effectively, and is complying with relevant laws. On the 2nd of June 2015, the Auditor General tabled his performance audit report, Fraud Management in Local Government. Councils are exposed to high risks of fraud and corruption because they procure large volumes of goods and services, often from local suppliers. The possibility that council employees are linked through their personal or professional relationships to suppliers can increase the risk of fraud because of conflicts between their public and private interests. In March 2013, we reported to Parliament that the risk of fraud occurring undetected in state government departments was unacceptably high. This audit extended the focus to the local government sector. We surveyed all 77 councils in Queensland to determine how they performed against accepted standards for fraud and corruption control. We focused on how well councils manage the risk of fraud occurring and remaining undetected. We examined, do councils identify their fraud risks and monitor them? Do councils implement fraud controls to prevent frauds from happening or to detect them when they do? Our audit scope included all 77 Queensland councils and the Department of Infrastructure, Local Government and Planning. We concluded that most councils are not good at managing their fraud risks. Fraud and corruption is happening, but few understand how widespread it is or what it costs them. Councils' response to their fraud risks are, by and large, inadequate for their inherent risk profile and demonstrate a lack of leadership and a failure in governance. There is a lack of management ownership in local councils for fraud risk management. Because executive and senior managers do not clearly instill in their staff the importance of managing fraud risks, staff may not be able to recognise fraud and know what to do if they suspect it. Councils over-rely on internal and external auditors to detect fraud. This also demonstrates a lack of management ownership and is indicative of a passive approach to fraud risk management. We demonstrated what can be achieved with data analytics and detailed analysis for identifying potential fraudulent and corrupt activity. Through our own analysis that we performed at one council, we identified potential fraudulent and corrupt activity, and we referred these matters to the Crime and Corruption Commission in accordance with the Crime and Corruption Commission Act 2001. Most councils don't know the extent of alleged and proven fraud. This shows they are not treating fraud risk management as a serious issue. Councils reported in our survey that they detected 324 cases of fraud over a 5-year period involving $8.6 million. Of the 324 fraud cases councils reported to us, they could not provide a fraud loss value for 57% of these cases, and 44% of councils do not have a system to manage fraud information. Therefore, the total amount lost to fraud is much higher than the $8.6 million reported to us. We compared our survey data with data provided to us separately by the Crime and Corruption Commission. 28 councils told us they had been a victim of fraud in the last 5 years, but CCC records show there were fraud allegations involving 67 councils in the last 5 years. This disparity indicates to us that councils are not complying with their legal obligations to report suspected and proven loss from fraud. There is no one agency in Queensland that has a complete picture of the incidence of fraud in the local government sector. There are different legislative frameworks for fraud reporting to integrity agencies, which means there is no consistent reporting approach. There are also differences in the legislative regimes that apply to councils and state government departments for recording and reporting fraud matters. The requirements for state departments are more prescriptive than what applies to local councils. State government departments are required to record losses arising from fraud and report it externally, but no such requirement exists for local councils. we have recommended the Department pursues amendment of the local government regulations to require all councils to record and report fraud. In assessing how local councils conduct fraud planning and prevention, we found that 65% of councils do not have a fraud and corruption control plan. This means that most councils in Queensland have no overarching plan for preventing, detecting and responding to fraud. The councils that do have a plan have a more structured path towards preventing, detecting and responding to fraud than those without a plan. More than half of councils do not conduct fraud risk assessments, which is essential for ensuring that any fraud control and detection program is targeted to the areas of a council most susceptible to the risk of fraud. Of the 28 councils that do, only 11 councils conduct the assessments as frequently as they should, at least every 2 years according to the Australian Standard on Fraud and Corruption Control. Only 19 councils use the results of fraud risk assessments to prioritise areas when developing the detection program. Because 61% of councils have not defined fraud and issued a policy statement, most councils lack a strong fraud control culture and do not practice preventative measures to mitigate risk. Councils' fraud detection approach are outdated in today's evolving fraud control environment. Perpetrators are becoming more sophisticated in their approaches, but councils' techniques for detecting fraud lack the sophistication to counter them. Both data analytics and fraud risk assessments were outside the top 10 detection techniques councils use to detect fraud. Councils' management teams over-rely on internal and external audit to detect fraud rather than taking ownership of fraud detection within their organisations. Councils' reactive approach to fraud detection means they are less likely to detect it early. We have recommended that all councils self-assess themselves against our report and develop, revise or update policies and procedures for fraud, corruption and management, fraud and corruption control plans, fraud risk assessments and data analytics capability for fraud detection. The Department has supported both recommendations and has committed to seeking a report from each local council on their progress in implementing our report's recommendations within 12 months. We trust that this presentation has been of value to you. The full report can be found on the Queensland Audit Office's website. Thank you.